Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for accommodating our last minute change of plan. Very kind. Really appreciate it. We had a little bit of a mishap that is a story for another day. I'll maybe feel calm enough to discuss it in the podcast next week or something. If anyone wants the behind the scenes stories of the stress of running the business. But yes, so getting on to more important things, I wanted to introduce Martin, who is one of the best speakers we have ever had in the community. Sorry, Martin, to heap on the pressure.
Not the pressure now.
Yeah, sorry. We invited him back on an important topic, which is burnout, because we know how much that can really affect our community. So I'm not going to ramble anymore. I'm going to let Martin dive straight in. Martin, I think I've given you screen share access, so should be all good to go whenever you are.
100%.
Want to introduce yourself
great.
even more? That would be lovely.
Great. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk about what I call the DNA of dyslexic burnout. Can you all see my screen there? And it should be more or less just the DNA of dyslexic burnout with a bit of blankness underneath it. And then afterwards, maybe there's going to be a question and answer, or Natalie and I can have a quick discussion about some of the issues involved, and people can join in. So I'm going to talk about a number of things, and this is going to be a bit of a staged process. So we're going to begin with the simple question of what is burnout? Because we all talk about burnout, and a lot of people say, oh, I'm feeling burnout, I'm suffering burnout, or don't suffer burnout. But it's really good, and it's a really good idea to have a good idea of what burnout is. So we're going to discuss that a little bit. We're going to then have a look at some of the signs of burnout. We're going to have a look at causes of dyslexic burnout. This dyslexic burnout is a form of burnout. It's not categorically different, but it's a particular form of burnout. Then we're going to have a look at the effects of dyslexic burnout, and then have a look at some strategies for preventing burnout and coping with burnout. So these are the six sections of today's session. I hope everyone's going to be a little bit happy with that. And I've tried to factor in this idea of the DNA of dyslexic burnout into this, because when I was thinking about this, I was constantly thinking about it in terms of DNA. So the first part is we're looking at burnout, and this simplifying it quite a lot, but there are two major strands to burnout. There's what you might call the social, emotional, and mental health side of burnout, and then there's the physical side of burnout. The SEMH, social, emotional, mental health side of burnout, typically, and this is again, I've restricted it for space reasons, but typically involves things like, also the physical part, typically involves things like loss of appetite, or craving junk foods. It involves cramps. Now, it can be physical stomach cramps, it can be headaches, it can be muscle cramps and muscle aches. It can be insomnia, or the opposite of insomnia, almost fatigue. So the inability to sleep, but the incredible tiredness. So this is what you might think of as the physical side of burnout. But then there's the social, emotional, mental health aspect of burnout as well, where we look at depression. And depression is, again, something we can talk about and something we can categorize later, if you'd like. Cynicism and irritability. Now, I'm going to say, by the way, I've suffered burnout, or rather, I've climbed high on the ladder of burnout, and we'll look at that later on. And I've suffered an awful lot of this. I remember going through a period only a year and a half ago, or maybe something like that, where I was becoming very cynical, very irritable. I'd lost the ability to enjoy myself. I'd lost this sense of enjoyment in life. And people who know me know that I have a lot of joie de vivre, and I love life. And I'd lost that. And I was aware that I'd lost it. And everybody around me was aware that I'd lost it. I also became detached. Now, this is not just a personal story. This is what the SEMH aspect of burnout is. You get something called detachment. This idea that you're distanced from the world around you. You're distanced from the things that you used to care about, from your work maybe, or from your family, or from your home life, or from your interests. It's almost as though you're on the outside looking in. And then there's what you would look at as a lack of focus or a lack of concentration. So this is the physical and the SEMH aspects of burnout, these two strands that kind of wrap around each other, and they're held together by behavior. So these things in the middle, I've called behavior, and behavior such as the inability to cope. And when we talk about the inability to cope, often we don't only talk about the inability to cope with what's happening. We also talk about, for instance, turning to coping mechanisms that aren't quite correct. And I can give you resources and sources to talk about this later if you're really interested. I mean, this is quite a sensitive topic, and anybody who wants to look at the sources and the research behind all this, please speak to us. So hoping you find it harder to cope, you also turn to the wrong things. You turn to maybe alcohol or junk food or drugs or just junk TV, or just you get lost down the rabbit hole of YouTube, that kind of thing. Anger. So anger, you start to display anger with people, with the world around you, with yourself. Withdrawal and isolation. So you retreat from the world. You don't play that part in the world that you would have done normally. And I've put in inverted commas procrastination, partially because procrastination is in itself a problematic term. But essentially what we all understand as procrastination, the inability to get on with things, what we talk about when we talk about executive function, task initiation. You lose that clarity of task initiation. So you get the social emotional side of this, where you get the depression, loss of appetite, cramps, cynicism, irritability, lack of enjoyment, insomnia, fatigue, detachment, and lack of focus and concentration. And then you get the inability to cope properly, the anger, withdrawal and isolation, and procrastination. And this is what burnout looks like. So you've got what's going on internally, and then you've got the outward manifestations of that. Now, I don't know if anybody's ever experienced this. If you've ever experienced this, you might start to think, actually, I recognize that. I've gone through that, or I know somebody else who's going through that. This is a really useful thing. So we're going to have a look. When we talk about DNA, again, often people talk about the ladder of DNA or DNA ladders, and I've used this. This one is particularly good because there's some research by a guy called Freudenberger, or rather the initial push for the categorization of burnout that we use these days was by Freudenberger in 1974. And he talked about the 12 stages, or the 12 stages in the burnout ladder. Unfortunately, this piece of DNA, this ladder of DNA, has 12 stages. So let's have a very quick look at what they are. And these are more or less accepted. Now, there's obviously dispute, but these are more or less accepted by the psychological community. Okay, the first one is there is a need to prove yourself. If anybody's ever experienced this need to prove yourself, often taking on jobs that are too big, often taking on too many jobs, often becoming a perfectionist, essentially trying to prove yourself in a world in which you can't because you're taking on too much. The next step is you find yourself almost because of this working harder, and in fact overwork. Now, just a very little anecdote. When I was going through this, I noticed very much, if people asked me how I was, my response would be, oh, work's hard, or I haven't got enough work done today. It would always be focusing on work and what I needed to do, what I hadn't done. And so I was always conscious that I wasn't performing very well. I needed to prove myself, and I was conscious that I wasn't performing. I was conscious that I was underperforming or not performing to this impossible standard that I'd set myself. The third stage in the ladder of burnout is neglecting your own needs. So these needs include food, sleep, hygiene, love, and social needs. We all do it, but it's something you notice with people going through burnout. So there's the need to prove yourself, there's overwork, and then neglecting your own hygiene needs, your own social needs, your own physical needs. Followed by conflicts. And here I put conflicts, internal and external conflicts. External conflicts are fairly simple to understand, which is that you start arguing with people. It's where the anger comes and the irritability and the cynicism. So these external conflicts where you're arguing with people, where you're constantly contradicting people, where you dislike what people say. Internal conflicts come generally in the form of, they generally come in the form of you. the things you want to do and the things you end up doing are different. So there's a conflict in what you want to do and what you have to do, what you want to do and what you feel you should do. And this, of course, leads to the external conflicts. It leads to the frustrations and the tendency to snap back at people. Then there's this. This is really interesting. Now, I've gone through all of this. And whenever I've looked at the ladder of burnout, I look at this and it just strikes me. Yeah, I remember this. The revision of values. The things that had been important to me weren't important to me anymore. Things like love, things like family, things like friendship, things like going for walks in the countryside, these things. For those people who have got any form of religious faith, you'll find even that your connection with your religious faith generally weakens a little bit. These values that you have, you revise them, and you become fixated on things such as work, these achievements that you've set yourself. And so the things that had been important to you cease to be important to you. And the things that shouldn't be important to you, the things that are causing this stress, often become the things that are important to you. This leads to problem denial. The idea that, nope, it's not a problem, I can do this. No, I'm not in a bad mood. I just don't have enough time. This classic problem denial that people go through and people suffer when they're experiencing burnout. The next thing is withdrawal. Withdrawal from and withdrawal into. So you withdraw from society, you withdraw from your friends, you withdraw from your social circle, you withdraw from your interests, and you withdraw into alcohol abuse. You withdraw into hedonism. You withdraw into YouTube. You withdraw into these, what you might call superficial pleasures. If you're trying to fill your life, because you're becoming quite empty. So you're trying to fill your life with things that just don't quite fill your life properly. This leads to behavioral changes. It leads to being late for things. It leads to not interacting with people the way you used to interact with them. It leads to people looking at you and thinking, she's not who I know, or he's not the guy I thought he was. So it leads to behavioral changes. And this, of course, can lead to social problems. This is a big one. I remember this very much, this depersonalization. The loss of self, loss of identity. You lose your sense of who you are. Now, this is really, really big. And I've lost this myself. You lose this sense of who you are. And actually, it gets replaced by this sense of what you need to do. This sense of, I haven't done enough. I'm still stressed. I'm still worried. I'm still upset that I haven't quite achieved this unattainable target that I've set for myself. So you lose your sense of who you are in terms of what you need to do. You then get this emptiness, anxiety, and compensation again. So you compensate with alcohol, for instance, which leads to depression, self-hatred, indifference, and possible self-harm. And even once you get to this stage, full burnout, which is breakdown collapse, and those things that require intervention. So self-harm and suicidal ideation, which require intervention. Now, this is the classic ladder of burnout. And I'd like you to see this, and I'd like you to think about it, because A, it may be that you have experienced it or part of this. It may be that you're actually somewhere along the lower rungs of that ladder, lower steps of that ladder, and it's a good thing to know about it. It may be that you can see it in others and that you can help people who are experiencing this burnout ladder. As I say, burnout is not a thing. Burnout is a staged process. The thing is, it turns out that this is hardwired into those of us with dyslexia. As I say, it's almost within the DNA of those of us with just that dyslexia. And by the way, I say this knowingly, and I say this in a very conscious way because of a number of things. The first thing is, there's a lot of research to suggest that your brain has to work twice as hard when you read, for instance. So phonological decoding, it's hard. More areas of the brain are working. The connection between Broca's area and Wernicke's area is not quite as good, and your brain's got to compensate around that. So your brain is working really, really hard. This means extra effort means it can be hard switching off. So you've already got that inability to turn off because your brain's working twice as hard, and it means it's harder to switch off. If you remember when you were at school, there's something called learned helplessness. Now, I assume that a lot of people know about learned helplessness, but I'm also going to assume that a number of people don't. Very quickly, what is learned helplessness? Okay, now very, very quickly, imagine an elephant. Now, thank God they don't do this anymore. Thank goodness they don't do this anymore. But imagine an elephant in a circus. And this elephant has got a chain around one of its legs attached to a stake of wood on the floor. This big bull elephant. And the bull elephant does not smash the wood and run off. Why? Well, it turns out that when the elephant was a pup, when it was a really young elephant, they chained it to this piece of wood and the elephant couldn't escape. The elephant learned that it couldn't escape, and therefore now the elephant believes that it can't escape, and the elephant can't escape. This is what they call learned helplessness. For me, a great example is Where's Wally? When I first did Where's Wally, I looked at it, or Where's Waldo if you're American. I looked at it and thought, I can't find Wally. I just can't see Wally. And then the next time I looked and thought, I can't see Wally. And then I taught myself that I'm not the kind of person who can see Wally. Well, I'm just as able to see Wally as anybody else. But I had now started to believe that I wasn't the sort of person who could see Wally. At school, dyslexics generally suffer something called learned helplessness. If they realize that they can't do the homework, then I'm not the sort of person who can do the homework. I'm not the sort of person who succeeds at school, etc., etc. So dyslexics have this learned helplessness, which is part of burnout. This idea of helplessness is part of burnout. And this is mixed with a memory of childhood failure at school, possible and probable bullying, by the way, but the memory that when you were at school, you were made to feel worthless. The memory that when we were at school, we didn't succeed, and the grades we got proved that we had no value. Because, of course, when you're a child, the value you have generally is given to you by the grades that you achieve. And you're kind of in competition with everybody else in the class, and you're at the bottom of the class, and you feel that. And so you've got this idea that you're working twice as hard in your brain. You can't switch off. You feel helpless. You feel that you can't do something. You've got this memory of failure and all that entailed. There is also something really interesting. A woman called Virginia, and I'm going to pronounce her name Sturm, although it might be Sturm, S-T-U-R-M. Virginia Sturm did some research. In fact, some others have done some research as well, but Sturm's research was the most famous, where they wired those of us with dyslexia up, or rather they wired a load of people up, some dyslexics and some non-dyslexics. And what they then did is they essentially played them music, they showed them videos, they showed them images, which were designed to elicit an emotional response. It turned out that those with dyslexia had a far higher emotional response than those without dyslexia. So it seems that the emotional sensitivity, similar to many other things, is hardwired into being dyslexic. Now, we don't know why. It could be because we've suffered a lot throughout life, and therefore it's made us emotionally sensitive. Or it could be that there is something inherently to do with dyslexia that makes us more sensitive. But it turns out that those with dyslexia are more emotionally sensitive than those without dyslexia. And this is then coupled with, again, I've mentioned executive function. There's something called emotional dysregulation, which is part of executive dysfunction, as it were. So one of the things that many with dyslexia tend to share with each other is executive function struggles. Executive function being things like problem orientation, decision action, working memory, and emotional regulation. And task switching, that kind of thing. Now, emotional regulation is the ability to recognize when you're experiencing an emotion, the ability to pinpoint that there is an emotion there, the ability to name that emotion, the ability to understand it, and then the ability, if necessary, to reframe that emotion. This is harder for people with dyslexia. This is all part of what they call executive dysfunction, so emotional dysregulation. Now imagine you already have heightened emotional sensitivity, and then you've got emotional dysregulation. In other words, you feel more, but you can regulate it less. You're already working twice as hard when you do the work at work or at school, because your brain works twice as hard because of the phonological decoding. You're putting extra effort in, that tires you out. You've got this learned helplessness. You've got this hangover of failure from childhood. You're emotionally sensitive, and you find it's really, really difficult to regulate that. This all becomes who you are. It becomes part of who you are. And you'll notice that with this, you end up with shame, withdrawal, inefficiency, by the way, because when you're working twice as hard and you feel that you can't do it and you're struggling to regulate your emotions, you become inefficient if you're at work. And then it leads to, again, this word procrastination. I was doing some reading about academic procrastination a while back, and the idea that when you're emotionally sensitive or when you're feeling emotionally dysregulated, it's harder to do a lot of academic work. It's the same with real world work, so to speak. So as you're feeling dysregulated, you end up having problems with task initiation and task switching. So it's kind of hardwired into being dyslexic that you've got this almost as though these manifestations of burnout already. And this means that, as I said, the symptoms are hardwired. The symptoms of burnout are already hardwired into the dyslexic DNA. It also means that it creates a vicious cycle, because where you're working twice as hard, where you're more emotionally sensitive about that, and where you struggle to regulate those emotions, what happens is then it makes it harder, and that makes it harder to regulate it, and you feel it more. And so you get this vicious cycle appearing where if it begins, if you're struggling, it's hard. If it's hard, it's hard to regulate that. If it's hard to regulate that, you struggle. If you're struggling, it's hard. If it's hard to regulate that. If it's hard to regulate that, you continue to struggle. So there's this vicious cycle that builds up. It also means that it's harder to spot. Now, this is really interesting. It turns out that a lot of these burnout symptoms, as it were, are harder to spot in those with dyslexia because we feel that anyway, because we've got that emotional dysregulation anyway. So it becomes harder to spot, which means we become like the dyslexics who cried wolf. People won't listen to us as though it's as though it's burnout. They'll just listen to us as though it's emotional dysregulation. We, the dyslexics, are, oh, it's those people being dyslexic again. It's them being sensitive again. Actually, it's not seen as something as serious. I noticed somebody's put something in the chat. I'm not going to look at the chat just yet. I'll have a look at it later on if that's all right, and then I'll answer later on. Okay, so going on the DNA theme, what we need is dyslexics need awareness. So here are some things to help dyslexics become aware of what's going on. First of all, we need to understand. So what we do is we understand what burnout is. Okay, so we've had a quick look at burnout. We can talk about it more. We can be more open about it. We need to understand what burnout is. We need to watch for the symptoms of burnout. I've gone through burnout. So if we go back to that ladder of burnout, I was about 3/4 of the way up, 4/5 of the way up. Thank God I didn't get to the very top, but I was really high up that ladder of burnout. Now I'm more able to watch for it. I'm more able to spot the signs of burnout. Then the idea is that what we need to prevent burnout is self-care. And it's a really important thing. We need to look after ourselves. We need to ask ourselves what's important to us so that we can self-care. This involves taking breaks. Something that I never did when I was going through this kind of burnout phase is I never stopped. And that made it worse. It made it harder because it means that I was more exhausted. And the more exhausted you are, the worse it gets and the harder it is to regulate yourself. You need to then identify the causes of the burnout. Fortunately, I was aware of the causes of the burnout, and it was something to do with work that was being imposed upon me from outside, and that I felt somehow that I needed to live up to. You then need to manage, and I only put manage here because I mean manage yourself, manage your work, manage your life, manage all sorts of things, manage your food. So make sure that you're eating properly, make sure that you make time for yourself, make sure that you can be a bit mindful from time to time. So this idea of management is followed by boundary setting. Again, When I was suffering burnout, I didn't set boundaries. And it was only later when I could step back and set boundaries that I could reclaim myself. And I say that seriously. I say reclaim myself seriously, because as I say, I had lost that sense of self, and the ability to reclaim myself is an extraordinarily important thing. To prevent burnout, exercise and hobbies, or just doing what you enjoy. I mean, exercise, hobbies, whatever you call it. It could be just sitting down and reading a book. It could be going out for walks. It could be exercise. For me, exercise is incredibly important. Without exercise, I can collapse. So things like exercise, hobbies, these things are really, really important to prevent burnout. Connect and talk. So remember, you withdraw from society as part of burnout. You withdraw from your social circles. Well, one of the things to do is not to do that, to try to build those bonds of social connections and talk to people. And finally, this is really important. When you start spotting those symptoms, as it were, you understand what burnout is. You watch for the symptoms. When you can spot them, you can talk to people and ask for help. It is incredibly important. There is nothing so strong as vulnerability. And I mean that very, very seriously. The next thing is delegate, nurture, and adjust, DNA. And this is where we're going to stop. So just a couple of things for delegate, nurture, and adjust. First of all, identify what you can delegate and prioritize what's important to you. Most of the time, the things that you think are really, really vital are not that vital. That's just the way that the world is. So identify what you think you can delegate and prioritize what's important to you. Under nurture, this is really important. Make time for sleep and practice self-compassion. So if you're suffering any of these burnout symptoms, try to delegate work away from yourself, try to practice self-compassion, sleep, touch as well. Touch is really important, by the way. There's a lot of literature on the importance of touch. If you're on your own, hug yourself. It's really, really important. The idea of self-contact is incredibly important. And finally, adjust. Seek to change what is possible where it's possible. And this action of adjusting, this act of changing anything, is an empowerment. And it's that empowerment that can break the cycle of burnout, believe it or not, because burnout is often this sense of losing who you are and disempowerment. And that empowerment, the ability to just adjust one thing, is so incredibly important to the idea of stopping the burnout cycle, collapsing you, and basically causing serious mental health problems. Okay, so that's all I've got at the moment. I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm just going to have a look at a couple of the questions.
Martin, the questions were just me. I think there was something you said earlier that really resonated with me. Obviously, running a business full time is very stressful, and I definitely get kind of on the edge of burnout a lot and have to kind of go back out. And so it's definitely a kind of topic I'm very familiar with. I also hear it a lot from my clients. I think something that you said that kind of really resonated is how you can find yourself going up the ladder, and it's not as simple as you're kind of in or out, but maybe you're going up and down. And that's definitely something that kind of I really resonate with. Kind of you start to dial up, and then you think, okay, I thought I'll go down, and then before you know it, you're back in your old cycles. And how burnout is really in the DNA of dyslexic people. I just thought that was really powerful. Katie's just said, when we talk about burnout and how it impacts dyslexics, what's the #1 sign that we should be looking out for?
So it depends from person to person. So the first thing to say about the ladder of dyslexic burnout, or the ladder of burnout, is that these are stages that are fairly common and fairly well observed. However, it can be that some of the stages get swapped around. So for individuals, some of the different stages can be swapped around, so they're not set in concrete. However, one of the things that I always notice is that this, as it were, this lack of focus. One of the things that I notice, and I've seen other people experience this as well, they stop being as focused as they were. And they stop, as it were, if you're talking to them, they're not paying you their full attention. They're always looking around. It's as though there's some kind of threat. And this is one of the things that happens when your brain becomes dysregulated, that you start to feel that there's a threat. And that threat can be anything from too much work to not enough time, to the people I'm talking to are upsetting me. And so I think one of the first things to notice in my experience of my own burnout and the burnout of others is that distraction and self-protection, almost distraction from something and self-protection. But it's really interesting because I don't know whether anybody else has ever experienced any of this, and whether in experiencing it you've got something that you share for what you've experienced.
Yeah, we've had another good one come to me, and it's a lady who's saying she's kind of struggling a little bit, and she's looked at maybe an ADHD diagnosis, but actually what they said is that the symptoms that she's displaying is both burnout and that low confidence cycle that can often happen with dyslexia, which you touched on as well. And that kind of feeling like you have to prove yourself can often come from that low confidence and that learned helplessness that you were talking about. I thought that was just so powerful. So how do you find, and you touched a little bit about on this, but a little bit more depth on that kind of connection between low confidence and low self-esteem from dyslexia that leads them to burnout?
Yeah, well, before I come to that, I'd just like to mention about the ADHD. And you said it was a lady who asked, a woman who asked. Now, before I say this, I just want to say I don't want to make any sweeping heteronormative generalizations. For those people who don't speak English around, so sweeping sexist generalizations, in other words. So I don't want to make any kind of all women are like this and all men are like this kind of generalizations. However, we can make some broad generalizations about ADHD in men and ADHD in women. Not for everybody, not for everybody, but in general, men externalize with their ADHD more than women, and women internalize with their ADHD more than men. And so what you'll get is that men are more likely to get expelled from school, or boys are more likely to get expelled from school. Men are more likely to suffer, to experience disciplinary action at work. Women are more likely to suffer mental health problems and to have low self-esteem and low self-confidence. So if somebody, if the person who asked you this question is a woman with ADHD or is an ADHD woman, it may well be that there's that internalization there already. Now, there's no science to say every single woman is going to experience it in the same way. That's not what I'm trying to say, but there are signs to look out for. So that's one thing. How do we spot it in terms of in terms of this low self-confidence? You can spot low self-confidence in terms of behavior. And it tends to be one of two things. It tends to come out in either bravado, or it comes out in sort of self-deprecation, putting yourself down all the time. How many, I mean, I'm working with a lady at the moment. I'm doing some dyslexia-related work with a lady at the moment, and she cannot talk about herself and say anything positive about herself without then saying, oh, but I'm an idiot. Or, oh, but only a little bit, or other people are better than me. She's not able to. It's really interesting to hear that. So yeah, I always look out for this inability to talk positively about oneself. This kind of imposter syndrome that people generally have, because we learn this at school.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's very true. Fiona, do you want to come off mute and ask your question, and then we can?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. My question is, I grew up with dyslexia, and as a child, I also got depression. So how can I, when I started my university now, and how can I just not go back the cycle? A similar question how we had it already, but I feel like it's such an easy trap. I know what's comforting, but also if I use too much of the comfort, I feel like already trapped.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you for the wonderful question, and it's a very important question as well. May I, before I answer, and part of my answer, may I comment? What a beautiful accent. Where's the accent from, please?
I'm German, but I did an apprentice, or like an gap year in Australia, so it's a mix
Okay.
both.
Okay, so Australia is really interesting. They've got Oz spelled and they've got lots of support, but still, actually, Australian awareness isn't that high. In Germany, the reason I asked, because I recognize the German accent, the reason I asked is that there is more social stigma about dyslexia in Germany than there is in Britain. And that's quite, I mean, even forgive my German. My German is außergewöhnlich schräg. You know, it's terrible. But in Germany, you have these words. People don't use the word Legasthenie anymore so much. They used to use the phrase Leserechtschreibschwäche, if you forgive my pronunciation. And now I think they use the phrase Leserechtschreibschwierigkeit, which is even harder for somebody like me to pronounce. And what this means is reading, writing difficulty, reading, writing disorder, reading, writing weakness. What we know, and this is really quite impactful, what we know is that where people refer to dyslexia negatively, where people refer to dyslexics as though they have a weakness or a disorder, this actually has an effect on the dyslexics. There's been a number of studies that show this quite strongly. So one of the things to say is that the struggles that you experienced, Fiona, have been essentially put onto your shoulders by school or by society. I was reading a study from I think she was called Veltin at Humboldt University in Berlin, that surveyed a number of people in Germany, and it turns out that the majority of teachers in Bavaria, for instance, believe that dyslexia is some form of it's the person's own problem and there's nothing that can be done about it. And it's one or two of them even believed that it was some form of curse, which is shocking. So one of the things to do is to try to reframe dyslexia, to try to reframe it as a difference in the way of thinking, and to ask yourself, well, you've got this far. You've gone through school, you've done your apprenticeship, you've got this far. You must have had some strengths in order to do that, and to focus on the strengths of who you are, rather than carry the echo of what your teachers will have told you or what society may have told you. Now, I can't tell you what your teachers or society told you, obviously. I wasn't there. But what I can make a guess at is that where society stigmatizes dyslexia, you will have been stigmatized in some way or another. And to try to think about that, to try to ask what happened, what was said to you, where it was said, how it was said, and to try to reframe that and think of yourself in a more loving way. It's this self-care again. Because we know that dyslexics have got all sorts of gifts. I don't belong to the Dyslexia as a Superpower Brigade, but we know that there are challenges and gifts. There are downs and there are ups. So there are ups as well as downs. And to try to focus on those and to try to say, well, actually, what is it that's helped me get this far? And what is it about me that's got this far? Because there's going to be an awful lot there that has done. I don't know if that answers any of your question, Fiona.
Martin, I knew you were one of my people, the fellow not dyslexia, stop calling dyslexia a superpower, but say that it has lots of strength team. Yes, I completely agree.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful. And I always struggled with seeing dyslexia as a superpower. So I'm really glad I found Natalie and Kate, because that made me really understand, because it's not a superpower, it's just you think differently.
Yeah, and that was what I was kind of coming on to add, I think. I mean, firstly, Martin, what a flex with that German. I was so impressed.
Ask Fiona and she won't be impressed.
Yeah, well, I was. And that's really all that matters. But I think one of the things I wanted to add, Fiona, is that kind of what I took away from your question is that you find yourself kind of in this perpetual cycle of starting burnout, ending burnout, starting burnout, ending burnout. And it's something that I see a lot in myself, in my team that, work with me. I have a full neurodiverse team, and then also my clients. And the thing that I would always say is that you are always struggling with burnout in that cyclical way if you don't accept the need for doing things differently and kind of acknowledging the importance of doing things your way, because that is easier for you, it's quicker for you, you're more likely to be focusing on the stuff that you're good at. That can result in things kind of being easier and therefore not getting the struggles with burnout. But I think, what Martin beautifully touched on is that becomes increasingly more difficult, and in countries where there is like less awareness and less kind of support and understanding of the importance of doing things differently and the value of doing things differently. But not to try and end on such a depressing note, so I'm going to kind of flip to a suggestion on kind of where to go from there. The thing I always say to my clients whenever they're in a situation like this is that you have to flip your thinking from, oh my God, what if this company won't hire me? Or what if I'm not good enough? Or what if I'm not capable enough? And to, if I can find the workplace that is right for me, I will thrive, I will be great. And it's my job to pick the workplace. It's not about fear and shame of that company not thinking I'm good enough, but it's like flipping the narrative and being like, well, if I work in the right place, I am going to thrive, and just being really specific about where the right place is. Now, that's a really long journey that you'll probably find yourself going on, but just to kind of give you a direction and a place to head on, I think that is kind of what I wanted to add.
And just to come in on that at the end as well, by the way, that we talk about learned helplessness and the danger, and the danger of when I talked about it as well, is that we talk about learned helplessness and then end the conversation there. Actually, Seligman, the guy who came up with the idea of learned helplessness, he didn't just think of it in terms of learned helplessness. He looked at learned helplessness as three things, as I think it was cognition, connection, and behavior. So you get this idea that I can't do this. You connect not being able to do it with yourself, and then you behave differently. And the alternative to this is what he called learned optimism, and you can practice learned optimism. And this is a really important thing, that you can actually stop the learned helplessness and turn it into optimism.
Yeah, I 100% agree. That's exactly how I flipped my conversation with learning Spanish. I was like, I can't learn Spanish, I can't learn Spanish. And then I was like, you know what? I can do something. Like I can start. And Martin and I started a conversation talking about Latin America and living abroad in South America. So thank you so much, everyone, for the conversation. Yeah.
Can I come in? I've just noticed. I've just opened up the conversation. There are two questions.
Yeah, sure.
One of them is from LL and one of them is from Sarah. Sarah's the latest one that I can see. So you said, can you ask a question? Yes, please. If that's okay for me to.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's kind of similar to, hi, by the way, I just wanted to say it was so cool to see, because I feel like I've been kind of stuck in maybe not really always understanding why, but it kind of put it all like in perspective there with your presentation. So I just wanted to say thank you for that, first of all. I kind of struggle with something similar, but I can see the value that I can bring, if that makes sense. And I can understand that I'm trying so hard, not necessarily to prove or like be worried about being fired per se. Like, I'm really grateful that the environment I work in is great, but it's more like to prove to myself. And I know obviously that comes from childhood and, struggling with dyslexia from then, but it's kind of like the burnout I feel like is almost self-inflicted. And I do things like exercise and all those things to kind of come out of it. But I still sometimes feel like I go back there, and then I give myself grace and like do things slowly or do things differently. So like if I'm tired throughout the day, I'll take a break and then come back to it later. Like I feel like I'm trying to do everything that I know how to navigate it. Even sometimes I don't know if this is the best thing, but fake it till you make it, where I force myself to do things that are not fun in the moment. I don't want to do them, but I know that they'll help me maybe get out of the headspace and come back to like a good kind of resting point. So I don't know if there's anything more that you could maybe suggest.
Yeah, maybe Natalie can as well, but there's two things that I'd like to say to that. First of all, I think you're doing exactly the right things. I think what you're doing sounds absolutely right. Except I wouldn't say fake it till you make it. I'd say practice makes perfect. I think that this is because the idea is, if you say fake it till I make it, you're giving yourself that imposter syndrome. You're giving yourself that sort of, I can't do that. Whereas practice makes perfect just means you know that you're getting better at something. And that's a different way of looking at it. I think the one thing that I would do differently, now that's the wrong way of putting it. The one thing that I would do extra, and the one thing that I do extra, is to be very open. Now, I'm heavily involved in a European Union funded project. Being British is quite difficult to do that these days, but I'm very heavily involved in a European funded project where we're trying to find ways into stable, fulfilling employment for autistic job seekers, young autistic job seekers. And we did an awful lot of interviews, focus groups, and one-to-one interviews, and with different, sounds horrible, different stakeholders. I hate that kind of language. One of the things that shone through really strongly was that, on the one hand, employers really wanted the job seekers to be open about their autism, because that way they would know and they'd be able to try to do something about it. But the job seekers were too scared to be open about it because they didn't know what kind of prejudice they'd face. And I generally find that the people I work with are very understanding if I talk about my dyslexia and I talk about my issues, because they're human just like everybody else. So I'd be really open about it. That's the only other thing. I think you're doing exactly the right things.
Natalie had to pop off, but Sarah, it's the same thing. That's the advice that we give is be as open as you can be and always lead with the positive. It sounds terrible to put the employer first, but that's what we always say is what does your employer get out of making this accommodation for you? Are you going to work faster? Are you going to work smarter? Are you going to get more done? Like, how does the employer benefit? And when you frame it in not a, this is a deficit on me, but more of a, this is a benefit to you, most employers are super easygoing and happy to like make the accommodation as needed.
Yeah, no, I think, sorry, maybe I didn't articulate myself in the best way. The problem per se is not necessarily the employer, like they're not seeing any gaps per se. It's more like internal, if that makes sense. Like I feel myself getting exhausted. I feel myself, and it's not from pressure of like having to get the work done at work. Like no one's putting that pressure on me. It's just more about me wanting to do the best I possibly can, and comes with recognizing obviously I can't be 100% of the time all the time because I'm not a robot, and that there's like, you know, overworking, as like you mentioned in the presentation, where it's like you're using more of your brain all the time. So it's like I can recognize those things, recognize I bring strengths as well. Like it's now just trying to shift myself to like not let it get to that, I guess, feeling of overwhelmed that leads to kind of burnout. And just like kind of, I guess, like learning how to stop it earlier so it doesn't get so bad, and then also managing to get out of it and not go back into it, if that makes sense.
Can I ask very quickly, and this is something you might not want to answer, and it doesn't matter as long
That's
as
okay.
internally, but
Yeah.
what are those things that you really love in life, and what are those things that you think you might be missing at the moment, and is it possible to access at least one of them? So what I mean is a very silly example. I mentioned this. Forgive me for saying this. It's a personal thing, and it doesn't impact on anybody else here. But I'm a Christian, and I noticed that I was not going to church. I didn't have enough time. I felt I wasn't doing that, and then I just said, no, I'm going to do this, and it had such an important impact on me. And the same, it may be that you're not speaking to your mum as much as you want to speak to your mum. Forgive me if that's a sensitive thing to say. But it's that thing. Often there's something that we know actually nourishes us. There's a nourishment that we can get from somewhere. And it's connecting with that thing that helps nourish us. And that can really help. There's no assumption that you're not doing it, but
Yeah.
maybe, you know.
Yeah, maybe I need to do more of it.
Well.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Sarah, that internal pressure that you put on yourself, I think most of us feel, especially when we come from a dyslexic background where we've had to work so hard in school. And so that's a hard work ethic is there, and it never feels like you can put things down. To Martin's point of nourishing the things that fill you up, a lot of times when you leave the I shoulds and go to the I wants, it makes those I shoulds less painful. So you're not having to put in as much time to get the thing done because you need it to be 100%. It doesn't drain the battery in the same way because you have that full tank of gas of like, things feel easy because I've let my mind go to places that I enjoy versus I have to do this, I have to do this, I have to.
And yet, as Samantha has said, that that process of trying to take care of yourself can in itself feel like stress, and it can add. It is a balance, and yeah, I wouldn't. In those cases, I wouldn't want to offer bad advice to anybody. But the other advice I would give is back to what I said, is about connecting with people and talking and asking for help as often as possible, because there's nothing wrong with that. There's, as I said, there is no strength like vulnerability. Can we just very quickly talk to LL? I don't know if we have a 90s hip hop star in the group, but if we do, I'd love to.
So LL's comment, I believe, says, daughter in the 6th form UK recently diagnosed with dyslexia, has achieved high grades in school and exams, but also works extremely hard, leading to burnout. Teachers are now aware that she's dyslexic, or that she's dyslexic, but still expect the same results even though they know.
It breaks my heart. I see this again and again. In schools, teachers who are not only legally but morally obliged to change what they do and what they expect, who don't, because teachers are stressed people. Teachers have got too much on their plate already. Teachers are hated by their school kids, reviled by society, and work too hard. And yet they have a moral and a legal responsibility to help your daughter, to not demand the same output, because where you're dyslexic, you are legally allowed extra time in exams, for instance, which isn't that helpful, but it's something. Or you're legally allowed to take one lesson off to improve on the thing that you're struggling with. So if you really need maths and you don't need languages, you can take off French and you can practice maths with a tutor. So you're legally allowed this, and morally you're allowed this. And it's, I think, I don't know whether it's the teachers who won't, the teachers who can't, or whether it's the head teacher who isn't leading by example, or what. It makes me truly sad to hear it. It really does. And if I could talk to those teachers, I would. And if you'd like to give me their addresses, I'm not more than happy to. But yeah, it's I see it over and over again.
All right. On that note, it does not look like we have any more questions, and we are right at time. Martin, do you have anything closing before we do a final little wrap up?
Yes, I do. Very, very quickly. I have been through burnout. I've been through many of those stages of burnout. Thank God I didn't get to self-harm, but I was just about everywhere else. So if I very quickly, let me show you very quickly where I was, because I think this is quite an important thing to share. Let's see where I was. Right. There we go. I was there, which is quite hard, quite a difficult place to be. And being there, I came out of it. Now, I don't know exactly how, and not everybody, most people who experience burnout don't know the steps they take to get out of burnout. But I know that some of it was setting boundaries, some of it was standing back and and sort of learning what I needed to be able to delegate and say, that's not important to me. Having that bit of distance, however that happened. But it's just a word of encouragement that I know a number of people who have experienced burnout, myself included, and it's not forever. It can get better, and the resilience that we have, especially as dyslexics who've been through life, can be a great help.
All right, on that note, thank you so much, everyone who dropped in. We are so happy to see you guys this week. Next week concludes our final week of What If Dyslexia Was Easy for Dyslexia Awareness Month, the last week. And we are ending on a big note. We're going to be talking about confidence. So we're going to be providing you with some fun resources, as well as a great talk by Natalie on confidence, the Queen of Confidence. So we look forward to seeing everyone there. We're also going to be getting this recording up in the next 24 to 48 hours, and you'll get the email weekly replay in your inbox tomorrow. But thank you everyone who could join us today and for being so grateful for us, or moving things around a little bit. And we will see you all, I believe, next Tuesday. So thanks everyone for joining.